Hello, everyone. I'm Colonel Retired Steve Lee, the Senior Vice President of the Korea Defense Veterans Association, and welcome to a very special presentation. With us today is Mr. Rick Bogusky, a KDVA member. And at KDVA, we truly treasure stories by our members because every one of us, we help build the alliance. And so in KDVA, we say we are the alliance. And so, Mr. Bogusky, a very unique story, multi-generational connections to Korea, is going to tell us his story. And then at the end of it, I'll ask some questions, and then we'll conclude the program for the day. Okay. So, Mr. Rick Bogusky, we'd love to hear your story, sir.
Good morning, Steve, and thanks a lot. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm honored actually to be able to talk about my Korean journey. So this all began in 1976, but before that, as I was growing up in Butler, a small steel town north of Pittsburgh, the idea that Korea would be a major part of my adult life was comparable to thinking that I'd be going to the moon. It was impossible, and actually it wasn't even a thought. Anyway, as I was graduating from West Point in 1976, we had to pick assignments, and I was interested in going overseas. A position with the 4th Missile Command in Korea was open, but I wanted to do cannon artillery instead of missiles. So instead, I selected an assignment to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. While attending the Field Artillery Officer Basic course at Fort Sill, they asked for volunteers to go overseas, and I put my name in, not knowing where it might be. The options were Greece, Turkey, Italy, and Korea. Well, in a few short days, I learned that I would be going to Korea and that I would attend the Defense Language Institute, DLI, beforehand to learn the language. You know, they say never volunteer for anything in the Army. But in my case, that simple act set in motion what would be a most rewarding career in the Army and in my post-military endeavors. I spent a year at DLI and then arrived in Korea in January 1978 for my first assignment at Camp Page, Chuncheon, Gangwon Province. By the way, that's the home of the 4th Missile Command that I did not want to go to. So after that assignment, I went to Fort Carson, and having commanded there as a first lieutenant, I applied for and was accepted for early designation into the Korea Foreign Area Officer Program. And I attended the FAO course at Fort Bragg in 1982, followed by a FAO assignment as the Deputy G5, 2nd Infantry Division at Camp Casey in 1983. From there, I extended for another command with 637 Field Artillery at Camp Eseons in Gyeongbu, Korea, and I returned to the US in 1985. Following graduation from the Command and General Staff College, I returned to Korea to be the Battalion Executive Officer for the 1st of the 15th Field Artillery at Camp Casey in 1992. I had hoped to stay in Korea following that assignment for a FAO position in Seoul, but the Army sent me to DC, where I took a FAO position as Chief of the Korea Division at DIA from 1993 to 1996. I then returned to Korea and spent a year as the US Executive Officer to the Deputy SINC CFC, followed by a year as an Army War College Fellow at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, KIDA, which was in Seoul. I then returned to the US in 1998 to work Korea-Japan issues for the Deputy Undersecretary of the Army for International Affairs, and I retired from the Army in 2000. Subsequently, as a civilian, from 2013 to 2017, I supported USFK CFC as a liaison officer for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DITRA. So that outlines my assignments to Korea. But as everyone who has participated in these forums talks about, it's relationships, the relationships that we build during our time in Korea or working on Korea issues. And certainly that was the case for me. The relationships were the most important part of it, and they serve as the bedrock for everything else. So first and foremost, I need to recognize my primary Korean instructor at DLI, Mr. Paek Hak Moon. He was a wonderful man, and under his tutelage, I came to love the Korean people, the food, and the traditions. All that was even before I set foot in the land of the morning calm. We maintained contact for many years after I left DLI, but he has since passed away. My first assignment at Camp Page allowed me to immerse in Korea. Our unit worked solely with the ROK Army, but I was an oddity in that, to my knowledge, I was the only officer ever assigned to that unit that was language trained. I saw firsthand how hard the ROK Army worked in conditions that we in the US military could not imagine. I also got very involved with the civilian community by teaching English in my spare time. A departing captain asked me to take over a class of college students he had been teaching. And then by coincidence, the head of the Korea department at DLI visited, and his classmate was the president of Kangwon National Bank in Chuncheon. And at a dinner, he suggested that I teach English to the folks at the bank. Well, this was mostly gratis, but the experience with the people was truly priceless. At the university, I met the woman who would eventually become my wife. But that long, difficult process is a story for another time. But in short, I wrote an article in the KDVA Journal about my father-in-law, a man I had a great father-son relationship with following my marriage. But he did everything in his power to prevent that marriage from happening. I've often said that Korea is a land of contradiction or paradox. So even though Professor Kim was a worldly man with experience with US and other Western personnel, he was very much a traditionalist. And at the time, intercultural marriages were looked down upon. Anyway, Joanna and I got engaged, and when my tour ended, I returned alone to the US, and she completed her last year of college. I think my father-in-law thought that time and distance would put an end to our relationship. Well, a year later, I returned to Korea on leave, and we got married and returned to Fort Carson, where I was stationed. From that point on, he and I got along great. And when our two boys came along in quick succession, they were treated very special, at times embarrassingly so compared to the other grandchildren. Here's an anecdote on the contradiction that I mentioned. 6 months after Joanna and I got married, her younger sister was married, as arranged by my father-in-law and the groom's father. My sister-in-law and her husband knew each other for less than 30 days before tying the knot, but they remain happily married today. Through the years, my father-in-law would tell me stories about his life, and I always encouraged him to write a memoir, but he refused. Once, while TDY to Korea, I brought an 8mm movie camera and recorded 4 hours of him talking about his extraordinary life. From that recording, I extracted information and wrote an article in the KDVA Journal about his service during the Korean War. It was centered around two cultures, two generations. He joined the ROK Army during the defense of the Busan perimeter, and being multilingual, he was assigned as a liaison officer to the 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2ID, commanded by Colonel Paul Freeman. Today, the 2nd Infantry Division headquarters is called Freeman Hall. Not mentioned in that article is the fact that my two sons were dotted on, who were dotted on by their Harabaji or grandfather, also ended up serving in CFC. So I think Steve mentioned this. We now have 3 generations of ROC US affiliation. Another person I'd like to mention who was influential in my journey is General Retired Kim Dong-shin. I worked for him when he was the deputy SINC, CFC. And for whatever reason, he took me under his wing and we remain friends to this day. I say friends on purpose and with respect. When I worked for him, it was a professional relationship. I was a lieutenant colonel. He was a 4-star general. He later became the ROC Army Chief of Staff, and after retirement, he was the Minister of Defense. And even though he had position and stature at the highest levels, he was a humble person and stayed in touch with me. I could not reciprocate in any way other than to be who I was and always be honest with him. An anecdote on that: when General Tillelly was SINC of CFC, he instituted a tabletop exercise to prepare for the major annual exercises. After the first one, I gave General Kim a memo saying I thought the Korean generals were too scripted in reading from 3x5 cards instead of freely discussing the scenario. I thought this would just be a private communication between General Kim and I. But months later, when the next exercise was about to kick off, a US colleague in the C3 asked me if I was going to critique the exercise again. Well, over the years, General Kim has always been open with me, and we've had great discussions about important security issues on the peninsula. Our families have also gotten to know each other, and I feel blessed that we stay in touch. Let me wrap this up. My life really has been blessed because of my relationships with Korea and the Korean people. The lesson was that I always respected them and did not judge. I came from humble beginnings, but when I first arrived in Korea, I saw an even more humble environment. Could I have imagined that Korea would be positioned so prominently in the world today based on that initial impression? Not initially, but as I saw how dedicated and diligent the Korean people were, it was only a matter of time before the miracle on the Han would happen. One last thing, a bit of humor. The joke in our family is that I'm adopted. My 2 sons have Korean characteristics and they happen to marry Asian wives, one half Korean and one Chinese. And all of our grandkids look Asian. In a family picture, I'm the only Caucasian. So it's natural to think that they adopted me. Wow, how happy that my Korean journey has brought me to this point. Kachikapshida, kamsahamnida.
Oh, man, they're magnificent. What a journey that, started in a small town in the United States and ended up several decades later to where you are now. And the connections to your father-in-law, Korean War veteran, to your service in Korea over several years and tours, to both your sons having served in the Combined Forces Command recently. Just a story, quite honestly, like a few others. Um, I'd like to just ask a couple of questions. Um, you talked about very fondly, obviously, your relationship with then Deputy Commander-in-Chief General Kim Dong-shin. So could you take us a little bit behind the curtains of what are some of the key takeaways you had with the senior leaders, both the Koreans and Americans, at that time working together in CFC? What are some things that behind the curtain are some insights, sir?
Well, it's interesting. You know, that was the first time I'd worked at that level,
Mhm.
and you know, I have no idea why General Kim sort of, as I mentioned, took me under his wing. Um, it remains a mystery to me. He had no reason to do it, but he did, and you know, I'm forever grateful because, you know, in my mind, um, he was a wonderful mentor, and so all the interactions I have with him are always pleasant. Um, to your point, you know, there were weekly meetings. General Tlilly held weekly meetings with the U.S. staff, and you know, I'd be a backbencher in there, and just to see the dynamic and to see all the issues that the command had to engage with. It wasn't just, you know, the day-to-day warfighting
Mhm.
issues and preparations, but you know, congressional delegations would come in, presidential visits, all sorts of other things that the command had to cope with,
Yeah.
let alone any transgressions that would occur, you know, from the north. And as we both know, you know, that happens all the time.
Yeah.
Um, and at the reunion, you know, a lot of your speakers talked about those transgressions that were unknown to most of the Korean public, but you know,
Yeah.
people were being killed on the DMZ. Um, and fortunately that's less often now, but you know, it wasn't just a few years ago that, you know, some people stepped on a landmine. And
Yeah.
so it opened my eyes to the bigger world. You know, I was used to the, you know, seeing things at the tactical level, and I got
Mhm.
exposed to strategic issues and the whole process of, you know, how you deal with those.
Mhm.
Some you plan for, and some pop up, and you have to uh, take the planning, but also be reactive and come up with the right decisions for a very particular incident.
Okay. Well, good. Well, thank you for helping us better understand how the command works through so many diverse topics. Um, so let me just ask you something that I think a lot of our family members of Korean War veterans in particular have. They comment that, you know, their father almost never talked about their service in Korea during the Korean War. So how did you sort of engage your father-in-law and convince him to sit down with you and do these recordings so that his story does not get lost? Because this might be helpful for some folks in our audience.
Well, it was true for him. You know, he would tell stories about his life, you know, from child,
Mm,
and you know, his father sort of being, you know, anti-Japanese activist, um, and living up in Manchuria, and
mhm,
you know, from times to get away. Um,
mhm,
but the war he didn't talk about so much. But I had to force him. You know, it was
mm,
like I had this camera, and we sat down, and at the beginning, no, I don't want to talk about it. I want to talk about it. But then he started talking,
mm, mm.
and I had two-hour tapes. And once he started talking, it just flowed.
Okay.
You know, it he just, the hesitation evaporated, and he was talking about life.
Mm,
And but it, you know, there was great hesitation on his part to begin with, and some switch turned on. And I think just in talking about his life before the war, and it was a natural thing just to keep talking about it,
yeah.
you know, through the war.
Okay.
But you're true, and if I can, uh, you know, my father was in World War II,
Mm,
and you know, that generation never talked about it.
yeah. Yeah.
And just recently, my brother gave me an album of photos
Mm,
from when my father was serving in France,
mm,
and again, looking through these pictures, unfortunately, my father's passed away now, but, I never had the opportunity to ask him to talk about his experience. So I think it's not uncommon that all of us who are children of the generations that fought in that war,
Yeah.
the World War II or Korean War, were left wondering, what did they do? What was their experience? What were they feeling? So I guess I was lucky that I kind of pressed the issue.
Yeah, and so I think the point and the big takeaway is there's still time, and we don't want to lose these personal accounts that are unique to each person. And perhaps people can take a technique from you, and that have a recording device ready, have the veteran start just talking about his life, and then maybe once that momentum starts building, he'll start talking about Korea. But certainly don't force it or make them uncomfortable. It might take a couple of engagements, but what I would please tell our audience members is, after you do that, please share it with us. Put it in a short article, or, if you want to share some of the outtakes from video or audio, we'd love to continue to share it, because there are so many lessons that we can take away from that. Speaking of which, so you have two sons who are currently active duty. So what are some of the experiences from working in Korea that you learned from your father-in-law and from yourself that you passed on to your children?
Well, first and foremost, being active in the military and their Air Force. So nothing against them. They grew up in the Army, and but they wanted to fly, and they both achieved that goal with the Air Force. But I did just try to pass on sort of common sense leadership stuff to them. No matter who you're dealing with, deal with them the way you want to be dealt with. Okay. Treat everybody with respect.
Okay.
They had, when they got assigned to Korea, they were very familiar with Korea. So there was, I think they had the advantage of being able to naturally just fall into, the ROK-US relationship, because they had spent so much time in Korea and familiar with the culture and interacting with Koreans over the years. But some have a hard time with that. Yeah. And it's unfortunate, because they shut themselves off from great experiences. My first assignment in Korea, there was a lieutenant who never left post unless he was going out on a mission. And I thought, you're missing such a great opportunity and a beautiful culture. So I mean, that's an extreme, but there are others who get to Korea and they're very comfortable in little America on base.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I always push people to get out. I always push people to get out. When I was the deputy G5 at the division, every month, we had a newcomers briefing, and I would provide information on the culture and on Korea, and really encourage folks to look at the good things that were all around them, and steer from the negative things. But there were so many good things that they needed to take advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, Korea, beautiful country, 4 seasons, the best airport in the world, like 14 straight years.
Yeah.
Seoul is one of the most visited cities in the world. It's in the top 10. And the Korean people overall, if you're a American and you make any kind of effort to speak Korean, I mean, they're just so thankful that you care about their culture enough. And especially if you do that in a restaurant, you're going to get some extra stuff. So thank you for that. So one of my last questions is, I know that after the military, you served as an executive for a defense contractor. And I know you're very heavily involved in mentoring people as they transition from the military to civilian life. Any helpful hints while we have you here?
Well, Steve, probably the most enjoyable part of my job was the interacting with people and bringing individuals on board. Of course, I was focused on a lot on, prior military folks. And, I even used to go to Fort Myer and give talks to what was at that time the ACAP program, as people were getting out of the military. And, I had gone through that. And so I talked from my own experience of, you leave the military and going out to the civilian world. And the thing that I would say most is, and again, I felt this, I was very anxious when I was getting out of the military. What am I going to do? I've been an artillery officer. Am I going to go and blow things up? Of course, I was a fail, but there, I put it in this way. There's a bird on one shoulder, and it's the voice of doubt. And there's a bird on the other shoulder, and it's the voice of confidence. And I would tell everybody, the military has prepared you tremendously for life after the military. So knock the bird of doubt off your shoulder and just focus on the bird of confidence. I said, look around you. You see lots of people who have been in the military now retired, and they're living wonderful, productive lives. You can do the same thing. Just first of all, be confident in yourself that you're prepared for civilian life. 2, be yourself. I was given lots of advice in the ACAP, and some of that advice made me uncomfortable. Like, well, am I going to be phony by trying to do that? So I decided just to be myself, and in doing that, I was more comfortable, and it turned out to work out great. So, be comfortable in your own skin, be yourself, and everything will work out. There are plenty of opportunities out there. Sometimes you don't know what you want to do, and you got to try it. And if it doesn't work out, then, there are other opportunities that you'll fall into. And don't worry about it, because it's all going to work out. I mean, it worked out for me. It's working out for you, and so many thousands, tens of thousands of others.
Well, great, sir. Again, I really appreciate that you spent this time with us. Any departing words?
Well, I'm the one who appreciates the opportunity to talk with you. I always enjoy talking with you personally, but if I can share a story, if this helps any others, gives them the courage to tell their stories, because there are many out there, and they have lots of things to say, and both on the U.S. side and the ROC side. So I appreciate the forum. I appreciate all you do and all that KDBA does, and I wish you all the best going forward.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rick Bogusky. Perhaps in a future interview, we can perhaps focus on the military transition to civilian life. I don't know if you would be interested in doing that, but that would be something I think our audience would really appreciate.
Sure.
Okay.
Love to do
Wonderful. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And KDVA had a wonderful year in 2021. We had 48% membership growth. Pretty amazing. This year in 2022, we expect to be over 50-60% in membership growth. So please get on board, bring your friends and family. As an associate member, anyone who's interested in the Korea U.S. Alliance and our veterans can join. for free at kdva.vet. That's VET. And so until next time, ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to working together for the ROK US Alliance. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Steve.